Thank you for joining us. Welcome from me, Michael Scott, in Oxford in the UK, and from my joint convener, Sanford J. Ungar in Washington, DC, to this, the 48th jointly promoted event between the Future of the Humanities Project and the Free Speech Project. The latter is sponsored by Georgetown University and the former by Georgetown's Humanities Initiative in association with Campion Hall, Oxford, and the Las Casas Institute for Social Justice at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. Together, the two projects consider issues concerning human dignity, rights, cultures, histories, traditions, and freedoms in a wide spectrum of educational activity, policy, expression, and aspiration. In a moment, I'll hand over to Sandy, who is the director of the Free Speech Project. He will introduce today's distinguished guests and moderate the ensuing discussion before I return to chair the question and answer session. From the start, you can type in questions to the panel by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please use the Q&A button and not the chat button. These questions will come to me during the session, and I will try and put them to the panel to consider. We urge you to ask questions as and when they occur to you so that there's no bottleneck at the end. I'm looking forward to this discussion very much. Thank you. Over to you, Sandy.
Thanks very much, Mike. I think we're all looking forward to bringing up some things that we know about, but somehow push behind the curtain and don't talk about. We have a wonderful panel today. Fanta Aw is the executive director of NAFSA, the Association of International Educators, which is the primary promoter of study abroad and around the world, and has done a great deal, operates in, I believe, more than 140 countries, or has members in more than 140 countries. Fanta had a distinguished career at American University in Washington before moving on to work full-time for NAFSA. We also have Lord Johnny Oates from the British House of Lords, representing the Liberal Democratic Party. He's done a great deal of humanitarian work, especially in South Africa and Zimbabwe, and has a unique perspective on these matters. Anne Lonsdale is a sinologist, and especially interested in Asia, and works at the University of Cambridge in the UK. So we have both Oxford and Cambridge represented today, with Mike Scott in Oxford. And Lou Goodman, another former colleague of mine and Fanta's from American University in DC, former dean of the School of International Service there, and a tireless investigator of what's gone wrong, especially in Latin American and Asian countries. I have a long interest in this matter myself, having done quite a lot of work in Africa, among other parts of the world. And so this is a subject that's near and dear to all of us for different reasons. I want to start by asking a sort of a grim question of our four panelists, each in turn, to say, what if you could fix things, and say there's this one particular crisis, one particular international problem that needs much greater attention. When that's what it is, I'm looking at the newsletter of the International Rescue Committee, which says there are 120 million displaced human beings in the world, which is an extraordinary statistic. So, Fanta, let's go to you first. What's the one crisis you think is being neglected, that is you're most sorry about?
Wow, Sandy, you don't ask easy questions, but I will take this one on. I would say, given the length of the crisis, given the instability that this crisis has had for the region, and just the sheer devastation, I would say is the Democratic Republic of Congo. Would be definitely the one that immediately comes to mind, just because the sheer devastation that has taken place and the horrific consequences that it has had cannot be understated. Simply cannot be understated.
Well, as you say, it's been going on for a very long time. Johnny, what do you say?
I mean, it's very hard to pick from such a wide range of crises that we're seeing. I think I wouldn't go geographic. I would pick the silent crisis of malnutrition, which is a real global crisis. It's responsible for 45% of all child deaths. That's over 2 million children every year, but more than that, millions of people who don't get the nutrients that they need aren't able to develop physically, cognitively, aren't able to contribute in the way they might to their economies, to get the education they need to develop the societies. So I think it is a massive crisis. It's not talked about enough. Bill Gates often says that when he's asked, if you had a magic wand, what is the one thing you would solve? And he always says malnutrition, because it's so foundational to so many other issues. So that's what I would pick.
And how about you? And you're on mute.
Apologies. A really difficult one. From the point of view of the numbers concerned and the long-term problem, it's probably Sudan for me, but there are so many competitions on grounds of all sorts of things, but Sudan embraces both difficulty between cultures, which is long enshrined in the way things happen, and after everything else, the difficulty of the Sahel and climate change. And it's a completely insoluble problem, and it's somehow on nobody's in tray, and nobody can begin to think how they'd fix it. So, probably Sudan.
Right, thank you. Repeated internal civil wars have contributed to a steady decline. Lou, how about you?
Well, as a person who's focused on Latin America for a long time, my heart has bled for people in Haiti for decades, and for less amount of time for people in Venezuela. But the crisis that I would want to point to is the crisis the world is facing with organized crime. Organized crime was identified as a huge problem for the world by the World Bank more than 10 years ago. And there has been disappointing cooperation among nations. And organized crime is penetrating governments all around the world, committing horrific crimes against individuals and organizations, weakening the rule of law throughout the world. And I agree with Johnny that malnutrition is foundational for human life. The rule of law is foundational for good governance, and organized crime is fighting against it.
Well, thank you for that list. I wonder how you think this happens. I myself think there's an epidemic from time to time of compassion fatigue, where people say, I'm just wrung out. I have no sympathy or pity or left to use. Do you think, Anne, that's part of it, or are there stronger forces that?
I think it's part of a general feeling that the world is out of control and that there is nothing the individual can really do to contribute. And I think back to something like Band-Aid, where the individuals got really involved in some countries to help Biafra. Difficult case anyway, but I think that spirit has gone, and I don't think that the young are particularly involved. And I think that there are large parts of the world which were under Soviet rule, for example, or in China, which just are not involved at all in the idea of charity, and who find it very difficult. I remember talking about it in Kazakhstan to an audience of students and telling them what we were doing in Africa with an organization I was with then. And they didn't understand at all. They couldn't think why we should do it. how
I
ridiculous.
suppose that is difficult to get one part of the world to understand another
Yes.
if they haven't had a reason or had
Yes.
experience.
It's not that they didn't know about poverty, and they did quite a lot to help the Kazakhs who'd been in China and had fled now with the attacks on the Uyghurs in China back into Kazakhstan. They were quite good with those. They did quite a lot of good things, but they didn't understand anywhere else.
Luke, to go back to your earlier answer, it's not that people have just heard about organized crime or have never heard about organized crime. We well know about international violations of the law and cruelty, the cruelty that accompanies it. Why has that been so difficult? There have been lots of international cooperative efforts, haven't there?
There have been some efforts. How far they've gone remains to be seen. But one of the things that we all know is the amount of technological change and the speed of technological change is increasing with each passing year and is likely to continue to do so. And technological change has made global markets available to organized crime in country after country, which means the assets that are available to them to commandeer for their own benefit has increased. And in Latin America, the phrase that we use is, plata or plomo. Do you take a bribe or do you take a bullet? And so with the amount of assets that are available to organized crime, and not just in Latin America, throughout the world, it's very difficult to contain and increasingly difficult to contain with technological change, and nations will have to cooperate. I'd recommend looking at the Organized Crime Index. It's a wonderful online site to see how things are going globally and in country after country.
Well, it's a grim view, I'm imagining.
It's a grim view in terms of backsliding, but it also points to some success cases, individual countries that are improving a bit, and even with the crises that are occurring around the world, there are some bright spots that one could point to if one wanted to.
Fanta, what do you think is a primary cause? Your exposure is so broad and deep.
Sandy, I would say it's a couple of things. You've mentioned compassion fatigue. I would say it's compassion fatigue combined with resource fatigue. We have that, but I think the primary cause really has to do with how we conceptualize the other and how we understand the other. I think in situations such as the Congo, Sudan, you think about Yemen to a certain extent, and several of the countries, and Haiti and others that you've talked about. Think about who are the people who are on these parts of the world. Where's the geography of it? I don't think that is accidental, that there's such a neglect of those areas of the world. Whereas you see in Ukraine, where it's on our news radar on an everyday basis. You get the feeds from it, and in so many ways. So I do think this piece about who it affects really does play into this, and what the media chooses to focus on, I think, is a big part of it. There is social engineering of compassion, right? We have seen, videos. We've seen the voices of survivors and others that come to our screens. And it really behooves us to be more compassionate when we see that, when we're seeing children that are being affected in a certain way and so forth. And yet, even that is being triaged to a large extent in terms of what we're able to see, when we're able to see it, and how it's delivered to us. So I think we have a larger issue here, and it's a systemic issue that we have in relations to how we look at these crises and what we decide, what we choose to confront or not. And from a nation state perspective, I think that's a big issue in terms of what is perceived by the most powerful nations to be an immediate threat versus what is seen as not necessarily a threat. And I think that calculation plays into what we're seeing. And I think these are false dichotomies that we're confronted with on an everyday basis.
Thank you. Johnny, you run a nonprofit dealing with malnutrition and hunger. And how do you measure your progress, or have you found some some new ways to stir international concern on these profound issues.
Well, I think if I may, just picking up on a point that Anne made and Fant has reflected on, today is the 40th anniversary of what became a very famous BBC broadcast of Michael Burke from northern Ethiopia. And it was a broadcast that was shown led the BBC evening news. In those days, a huge proportion of the population sat down and watched the BBC evening news together. So there was a shared sort of sense of what was going on. It was shown on 425 news channels across the world, including almost unprecedentedly shown on NBC without a US voiceover, which was unheard of at the time. It was incredibly powerful. Now, a lot of the imagery that was shot then wouldn't be shown now. It was seen in some ways as exploitative. But it did bring across to people the horror of what was actually going on. And the way in which the broadcast was put together it did create the sense of relatability. And there was a huge kind of reaction in the UK. Now, again, a lot of it was a sort of different style than we would take now to dealing with crises. But it was the UK really engaged. It did build a movement in the UK, which led eventually to us briefly meeting our UN target of 0.7% of GNI on international development aid. But now, of course, people are overwhelmed by so many different sources of news, so many different sources of media. I've been banging the drum here today and in weeks preceding about why aren't we getting the coverage of Sudan? One of the issues is access. It's very difficult to get access. Whereas in Ethiopia, they did manage to get access, perhaps surprisingly. So I think there's a lot of factors here. And then just finally on your point about how you measure success, I think it's really important for us to hold on to the fact, especially 40 years on from this news broadcast, when people can say, oh, but isn't it all the same? Nothing's changed. Remarkable progress was made in the world between 1990 and 2015. The proportion of populations in severe hunger halved. In Ethiopia, was reduced by 57%. We can, when we act together and in partnership with those host countries, we can make a difference, but we have to do it collectively, and we have to wake up again to that.
Let me ask you, that's a very good point. There have been periods of startling success and momentary success, perhaps. How do we revive those? How do we hold those up as golden moments that can be imitated or replicated? Fanta, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think the ways we can look at those as not just a moment in time, but things that we need to systematically, sort of pursue, is, as I think, as Johnny said, first of all, we need to have the international community come together and the global community really agree on a couple of key principles and make choices that reflect not just those principles, but really enact those principles. I think that's an incredibly important perspective in relation to that. The other piece related to the global community coming together, it requires leadership, and it requires really moral leadership. And I'm concerned that there's been, in many ways, an erosion of moral leadership when we look at what's happening around the world and how things are taking place around the world. And we need to go back to some of those principles, Sandy, if we're going to have any chance at this. The other aspect of this is we need to move away from what is short-sighted, short-term sort of thinking to really thinking about our shared humanity and the long-term investment we're willing to make. To think that what happens in Sudan or what happens in the Congo or Haiti or Yemen and others does not impact us is simply false. It really is. And there needs to be greater education about the interdependencies that are often misunderstood or not understood at all, so that the right investment can be made. Because in some cases, let's be honest, the investment that is being asked is not that significant when you think about how much we spend on defense on an everyday basis in many parts of the world. That is about moral leadership.
And this reluctance to act, as you say, adds to the refugee crisis and the displacement crisis, and then refugees and often displaced people are then blamed for problems and become scapegoats. Certainly, and not to put too fine a point on it, in the United States right now, that's part of what's happening.
I think that another.
Oh, yes, go ahead.
I think that I completely agree with the points that have been made, and I think I'd add another adjective to leadership, in addition to moral leadership, pragmatic moral leadership. And another thing I think that is helpful is to point to good examples and to show hope for people. One thing that I've observed recently is that in Bangladesh, there's quite a bit of tumult now. And people in South Asia are saying, let's not allow to happen in Bangladesh what happened in Sri Lanka. And they're saying in Sri Lanka, what happened was the great powers backed off and let local things be as they may. And there's a leader leading Bangladesh, Muhammad Yunus, who's a person that we can all admire. And the great powers aren't backing off yet. And to make that point, that if the great powers can cooperate and can show that they're observing what's going on, perhaps there can be a good outcome there.
I think it's
yes, go ahead, Anne, please.
Not merely a problem of moral leadership, it's a problem of getting back both morality and truth, because while we are now surrounded by fake news and fake stories, nobody really believes anything anybody says. We're used to PR, we're used to it coming at us from all sorts of things, mainly advertising. But the language of raising money is quite like the language of advertising, and there tends to be a cynicism which slips from one to the other. And there is also no sense that however carefully we prepare documents and send things out to people to show just what needs to be done in X or Y, nobody can believe it anymore. So we've lost morality and we've lost truth. How do we get them back?
How to get truth back is really a tough problem at the moment. I want to get back something Lou said. There is a sense sometimes that some autocratic regimes, some countries that don't operate according to highest moral principles, benefit from the chaos, the displacement, the starvation of people. And I wonder if it would do some good, to name names of countries, of leaders, of people who can be at least pinpointed as part of the problem.
I think we have to understand it's a very complex picture. I mean, there's the rather obvious bogeymen of the West, in particular Russia, Iran, etc. But if you look at somewhere like the Sudan conflict and the complexities of various countries who are engaged in that conflict, some of whom are nominally allies of the United Kingdom and the US, who are supporting for different reasons, some to get their hands on the minerals. One country, the UAE, which denies its involvement, but is widely regarded to be heavily involved in supporting the rapid support forces. They have in previous years bought up huge tracts of agricultural land in the fertile parts of Sudan in order to secure food security for their own populations. So there are really complex factors here. But I think one of the problems is that the West is not seen to operate. It talks a lot about its values, but then it isn't seen to actually live its values. And I hear lots of people, particularly in Southern Africa where I've worked, say, we've got no problems with your values. We've got a problem that you don't live up to them. And that is, when we're talking about truth, we need to be true to ourselves. We have to be honest with ourselves, about the damage that we have done. We talk about the invasion of Ukraine and the breaking down of the rules-based system. The United Kingdom with the United States broke the system when it invaded Iraq. And we just got to be honest about it, and we're not being.
And Sandy, to just follow up on what Johnny talked about, the prevalence of revisionist history does not help matters, right? We want to go back and there's a failure of real education about the issues and an understanding of what is the core issue and how did we get here. And until we reckon with that, we're going to continue to make the same mistakes over and over again. And so the example of Sudan is a perfect example. And we have to also accept the fact that there's profiteering from wars. We're seeing it everywhere. And not acknowledging that does not help to solve the problem, because the Congo is a perfect example of a place that unfortunately has been cursed by natural resources. And where there's a war for resources, and so you're seeing the different power play that is taking place in Sudan, in Congo, but it's not just Congo, it's all over the place. So this piece about profiteering from war and whose vested interest is in that is something we have to reckon with and recognize. And the West has a major sort of complicity in many of these things that we're seeing. And it's not just the West, by the way, let's be clear. But there are enough powers out there that are profiting from this. And then when they're not profiting, they're complicit in other ways. And we've got to acknowledge that in order to fix the problem.
And what about China? There are many people who say that the Chinese have benefited from the long-standing crisis in Myanmar, what we used to call Burma.
Well, that's certainly true, and you can see it if you go up the river and you see the number of lorries coming over from China and taking away all sorts of materials, wood, but very, very more mineral materials, and just driving them off. So on that level, certainly that's happening. But China is what it's doing in Africa, apparently in a sort of humanitarian and para-colonial way, is totally based on self-interest in every way. I mean, it's based on getting materials for itself. It's based on getting allies for itself who will speak for it because they don't speak against it. And it's a country I love very much. I used to teach Chinese literature, and I went there in the early days in '64 and so on, when they were struggling against the madnesses of Mao, and 30 million died of starvation in the Great Leap Forward. And then one felt with China that they must get out from under this madness in which they were burying themselves. But they've not got out into a very good place. And they have many hazards against them. I mean, the water problems in China are going to be terrific. And so I think they don't really know where to go at the moment. And rather like Netanyahu, we're seeing Xi Jinping sticking where he is, clinging on by his nails almost to a slightly slippery wall, because there isn't a safe basis for more expansion, which is what his government needs. So I don't trust anything that China does. I love many, many Chinese people, but as Confucius says, you should love the people and you should hate the rulers.
Well, we
That's
see
a strange statement. Go ahead, Luke.
what's happening in China is probably more transparent than other places.
Yes.
China has a GDP that's almost the size of the United States, but its GDP per capita is 1/4 that of the United States. And it had the largest economy of the world until 1820, when the British started the Opium Wars, and because of their own problems with their own empire. And all that is very much in the minds of Chinese people. They've left the Summer Palace in Beijing in ruins to remind people of what the Europeans did when they came in. And China has a goal by 100th anniversary of the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 2049. They want to be an entirely middle-class nation. And in part, the regime's stability depends on their achieving those goals. They claim to have eliminated poverty by 2021, the 100th anniversary of the establishment of the Communist Party. There's good data that shows that just about everyone in the country is earning more than $2 a day. And what's a shame is that there isn't more cooperation and more engagement with China to sort of pull them along a path that can be productive and be a win-win situation overall. And it looks like it's a vicious circle rather than a virtuous circle that's going on in terms of China's relations with
Right. I want to raise another perspective, which is that there are many countries in the world, there have been and are still, countries that appear to fight the good fight, appear to make some significant improvements. Johnny, Zimbabwe is one that comes to my mind, where the Robert Mugabe won the internal civil war after independence, and everyone thought, well, we've got a real idealist in power in this incredibly fertile and country in southern Africa with great potential, and he became a terrible tyrant. It's like Ortega in Nicaragua, by the way, on a different scale, one might say, Lou. But how do we avoid the sort of wild enthusiasm for somebody who then turns out to disappoint us almost from day one in so many places?
Well, the first thing I'd say is, and I think the UK is particularly bad at this, but I suspect other countries as well, is choosing their favoured person. You know, Mugabe was the bogeyman, but then he became the guy. He was the Brits guy. It's actually about systems. It's much more complicated than it was ever shown to be, certainly in the UK. You know, why does Zimbabwe face a lot of the problems it has is because the white minority regime there did not understand the basics that you cannot rule indefinitely over millions of people who don't want to be ruled by you. They effectively militarized the political opposition. And now we have effectively a military government in Zimbabwe. And what few people understood in the West was that within ZANU, there had always been a massive tension between the military side of ZANU and the political side. And the war veterans were very much the people who Mugabe was scared about. And of course, it was the military who finally removed him in the end. But
ZANU, just to clarify, Zimbabwe
African National
Union, right?
Yes, sorry, the government of Zimbabwe. So without going, too much into the detail, but I just think, these things have long tails, and how we then behaved in Zimbabwe was, the UK gave a knighthood to Robert Mugabe in the midst of the Gukurahundi massacres in Matabeleland. We then decided we didn't like him and stripped him of his knighthood when they moved against white farmers. Now, people may draw conclusions in Zimbabwe that actually we didn't care about all the issues that we claimed to about democracy and human rights. We cared about the land belonging to white people. Now, that's a massive simplification. It's not actually true, but you can see why people believe it. And that's why I say we've got to live our values more and speak our values less, because people are just fed up with being lectured by the UK and other countries about values that we don't actually uphold.
Fanta, you must have many examples of this that you could cite from your travels and NAFSA's operations around the world. What are some of the most disappointing transitions as far as you're concerned?
No, I think Johnny touched on it. This issue of propping up leaders who become friends and then become foes, or start as foes and then become friends, seems to be that cycle that we have seen repeated over and over again, almost a playbook. And as we look at, the geographic map, whether it is in Africa, whether it is in the Middle East, in Asia and other places, there's two things that I think sticks out for me. And as we talk about what's happening in Palestine and Gaza and all of that, there are things that sticks to me, and that is we really have to get to the place of understanding the role of the leaders and how they're affecting things that are going on in those areas and the people. And that balance, particularly of really putting a face to the people part, I think is something that we cannot understate, and there's not enough of it that is done. I think we have that problem to contend with. The other piece is what Lou talked about. Disengagement is not the solution. Whether we look at the issue with China or with any one of these areas of the world, the principle that the answer is to disengage and to just close our eyes to what is taking place and assume that by disengaging, this is how you disempowered, is simply it's delusional. It is simply delusional. We've not seen things in history that have shown that to work. There's been no part of, of these wars that we've seen and with leaders that have been in these roles where disengagement has been the neutralizing force. There's no such thing. The other part of this, Sandy, is I keep hearing sometimes about neutrality. I do not believe that there's such a thing as neutrality. When you have people that are dying at the numbers that they're dying, when you have these wars that are continuing to go at the level that they are, that part of the answer is neutrality. Neutrality in what way? There is no such thing as neutrality. Sartre, I think, said it best: to not choose is still to choose.
And Sandy, I think that we'd be better off focusing on success stories than failures, and
Let's do that for a moment.
Drawing lessons from success stories. And the ones that are obvious are in East Asia, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore. These are countries that were horribly autocratic, very corrupt. Leaders came in that had a vision for changing society. They first established a monopoly of legitimate violence, which Max Weber said long ago was necessary to do things. And then they started to work within the rule of law. And one of the first things that was done was to have a campaign against corruption. Can you imagine what would have happened in the United States had George Bush announced a campaign for the rule of law instead of a war on terror, and had acted in terms of those values? We'd be a very different country today. We wouldn't have gone about invading Iraq and the terrible things that have happened. And then once you have a campaign against corruption, you start building up institutions that can create the circulation of elites that's necessary to bring new ideas in and to bring change in and to bring accountability in to deal with the kinds of issues that Johnny is so concerned about. Malnutrition is one, but there's lots of other issues. I get inspired when I look at how Taiwan and how far South Korea have come over the last 30, 40 years, and they did it themselves.
Well, South Korea, I certainly am familiar with what you're talking about there, in part from having traveled there with you long ago. But at the same time, in Latin America, I think back to Nicaragua. I think to the 70s and the 80s, and everyone thought they had a noble side in the Sandinistas that they could support against the corruption, the greed, the terror, the violence of the Somoza regime. And the winners, the Sandinistas, have turned into an exact replica of the people they defeated. Daniel Ortega, it's astonishing. I mean, sometimes I think if you live long enough, everybody will disillusion you. Your heroes will all disappear. Not that Ortega was a hero of mine, but I know that many journalists were so committed to telling the truth about Nicaragua and did so, only to be devastated by the reality.
Your heroes will disillusion you, as Robert Michel said in the early 20th century, if they stay in power for a long time, because the iron law of oligarchy will come up and they will make compromise after compromise to stay in power. That's what happened to the Sandinistas. But we also have to give the United States some credit for what happened there, because that revolution happened in the context of the Cold War. And the United States didn't want a social democratic government in that particular country. And they blocked the Sandinistas. And once the Ortegas got in power, the iron law oligarchy held, and it gets worse with each passing year.
And you had something you were about to say, and I didn't get to. Let me just say, by the way, that this would be a good time to put any questions or comments you have into the Q&A. We have a couple there now, but in a short time, we'll be going back to Mike, and he'll be taking the questions from our participants. So please feel free to put those in Q&A. And yes, you were going to add something.
Yes,
at this
I was
point.
very interested. I'm so sorry. I do apologize.
Sandy, while we wait for Anne, may I also say that in this
Yes,
conversation, let us not forget that we're the youth of these societies. Given the youth bulge that we're seeing in different parts of the world, we have seen that the youth often rise up and often get fatigued by the regimes that are in place, and also, frankly, get fatigued and also challenge what is often seen as the status quo and of interventions and others. And I do think that that's a group that we cannot forget as we have this conversation around. Not only are they very much affected by these wars along with women, but also they tend to be the ones who often will rise up in lots of different ways as we see. So just wanted to just put that also
That's a
on
very good. It's a very good point, Johnny. Were you going to add something? I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to respond to an earlier point that you had made about always being disillusioned by our heroes, and just to say, I mean, I was lucky enough to work in the first democratic parliament in South Africa. The picture on my wall behind me is of Andrew Palangeni, one of the Rivonia trialists who stood trial with Nelson Mandela. And I got involved in the anti-apartheid movement. When Nelson Mandela was released, I thought, oh my goodness, he can never live up to what he's been billed at. He was a leader who did know when to go. But actually, despite all the challenges that South Africa does face, it is a remarkable success story. In 1988, when I visited briefly when I was teaching in Zimbabwe, and I crossed the border at Bright Bridge. I've never been so relieved before or since to cross an international border out of apartheid South Africa, then under a state of emergency. If anybody had told you then that 2 years later, South Africa would have freed Nelson Mandela, that a few years later there would be democratic elections and a peaceful transition of power, people would have said you were crazy. They would have put you into institutional care. It was going to be a bloodbath, and it wasn't. So I think there's a lot of hope, and I think Lou is absolutely right to remind us of it, that amidst much bleakness, there are remarkable successes to look at, and we should hold on to them.
Absolutely. Fanta, I was going to say that one place where the youth were mobilized and inspired was in the downfall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War. And that is also a place, however, or a region where many of the people who inspired us so with their actions at the time, at the end of communism, have since disappointed us in other respects, have rather enjoyed coming to power and influence and I dare say wealth.
Yes.
In many of those countries. And
yeah.
And they have no excuse.
Yeah, no, that is absolutely true. And I do think it goes back to what was talked about earlier. There's a leader for different times, right? And Lou's point about knowing when the transition should happen, and a peaceful transition is absolutely key to both sustainability and change that is needed. And in many of the places where we're seeing some major just challenges, it is around these issues. It is around issues of governance. It is around issues of leaders who have overstayed their time, and in the process, frankly, have forgotten about their people and the importance of how they have a responsibility to uplift and help their people thrive. There's definitely a common thread among some of what we're seeing in terms of some of the major challenges in those different places as well.
I don't know what's happened to Anne. I think that I hope that John McCabe is in touch with her to try to. She was having some technical difficulties. Hopefully she'll be back. But it's a good time now to turn back to Mike Scott in Oxford and have a look at some of the questions that have come in from members of our distant audience.
Well, I thank you very much. A very sobering discussion, I'm afraid, but a very important one. Courtney Morris asks this question. Was the rules-based order not broken with everything the US did during the Cold War? The dictatorships, coups, proxy wars, etc. we supported. Was there ever a rules-based order? Lou, do you want to take that?
There's lots of evidence that shows that there really never was a rules-based order for everyone. And, there's the Melian dialogue from Thucydides that says, the powerful do what they want and the less powerful do what they must. And there's a narrative that the powerful create that suggests there's rules, but the rules benefit them. That's the way the world operates. And it's very important to try to minimize that as much as one can if one wants to create a level playing field.
Johnny, do you want to say something about that? From a UK rather than a US point of view, because it would have been the same.
I mean, I think any rules-based system, particularly when it has a unbalance of power, is not going to be fairly applied. And it's a problem. And we see it with the International Criminal Court and things like that. The most powerful countries aren't members of it, etc. But what you've got to ask yourself is, was it better to move towards the rule of law, for instance, in the United Kingdom from Magna Carta on, even though for most of that time, if you were favored by the king or somebody else, the law didn't apply in the same way. And actually, it's probably true today that very powerful people, the law doesn't apply to in quite the same way as it does to other people. But I'd still say it's something worth striving for and seeking to achieve, however imperfectly it is. Because when it all goes wrong, nobody does know actually then what they should do and what they can do. And societies and economies find it very, very difficult to operate.
Thank you. Patha, do you any question, any ideas from you on this one?
No, I concur with what my colleagues have said. I don't have anything to add to that specific discussion.
Salah Adin asks just a simple question. How can we solve a difficult answer? How can we solve the problems in Gaza and North Korea? Johnny?
Well, you will be surprised to know that I don't have a simple solution to give to you. And my knowledge of North Korea is limited. I've got a bit of a better knowledge of Gaza and the Middle East. I mean, what I'd say in terms of the Middle East is, after everything that happens and has happened, when, God willing, the violence stops as soon as possible, the hostages are released, etc., a fundamental truth will remain that Palestinians and Israelis will have to live together, side by side in two states, or side by side together in one state. But whatever, they're going to have to live side by side with each other. And I think it's essential that the Israeli government understands, and particularly the Israeli government, because it's in the more powerful position at the moment, two things. Firstly, as I said in respect to Zimbabwe, you cannot rule over millions of people who do not want to rule over you indefinitely. At least you can't do it without losing your soul and your values. Secondly, is that the Israeli people will never be able to live truly in security unless the Palestinian people can live truly in security. And it's true vice versa. So the fundamental tragedy, I mean, apart from the appalling carnage that has been inflicted on both sides, but particularly now ongoing in Gaza, is that the government of Israel has no strategy for justice and peace and security for Palestinians. And as long as it doesn't, it can kill as many leaders of Hamas or any other terrorist group as it likes, and it will not solve the fundamental problem. And when I hear about the kill rates of terrorists, etc., I look back to the history I read of white minority rule in Zimbabwe, in Rhodesia, as it was called then. And the communiques are almost exactly the same. We've killed this person, none of it goes to the thing. What is your political strategy? Until they can answer that, there's not going to be peace and security for either. But it's incumbent on leaders of both peoples to try and find a way through.
I think the question about North Korea, Mike, is also worth thinking about. It seems unimaginable that for so many decades since the Korean War, North Korea has been run the way it has. And Lou, I don't think you've been to North Korea, but you've been to the Korean Peninsula quite a bit. Do you have any
Well, I've seen North Korea
explanation?
because I've been at the border. First of all, I don't know if you've seen the news today, but it said there's 1,500 North Korean troops in Russia that are cooperating with the Russians to fight Ukraine, and the numbers will be increased to 15,000. And the question is, are they there simply to see how the arms that they've given Russia are being used, or are they there to get battle experience for a war that they'll eventually fight against South Korea? And so, North Korea is an issue. The alliance between North Korea and Russia is something that Russia has aspired to for decades. And it's only been strengthened recently. You may have noticed that President Putin went to North Korea, not from China, but directly from Moscow. You can see some reluctance on China's part for having this relationship happen the way it is. North Korea right now functions as a buffer for China. And from China's perspective, Japan and Korea as a whole should be its allies, not the United States' allies, because they're so close to them. So there's lots of dynamic that has to do with the interest of China and the interest of Russia and the national narrative of North Korea that says that the Kim family is the historic are the historic leaders of the peninsula, and they should have legitimate control over the whole peninsula. So it may seem unbelievable to us, Sandy, but the narratives and the actual interests that are there are pretty complex and haven't begun to unravel at all recently.
Thank you for that. I want to finish with one other question, which is, throughout this program, the United Nations has never actually been spoken about. Why is that? Anne, you're on mute, Anne. Welcome back. You're on mute.
Yep. Because of the hopelessness we all feel about being able to make it act. Because we've seen how it's lost all traction in the Palestine-Israel problems. Because the effect of the Security Council veto has taken so much power out of it. One can't see how to get back. I mean, the effect of treatment of the UNRWA people in Gaza, and there's so much going on against it at the moment that I don't know how we retrieve it.
Lou?
I haven't mentioned it. I was tempted to mention it with reference to RTP, something that I hope the United Nations would get behind after the Kosovo War, and has just fallen off the table for the reasons that Anne has said. And I think international relations scholars are focusing more on the alliances that have formed, especially since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and how those alliances are changing and how they can be sustained, and how they are not multipolar, but they are multiplex and require tremendous interaction capacity to sustain them over time. And this is a challenge that faces all nations, and the more people they have in their diplomatic corps and the more embassies they have, probably the more successful they'll be. And you can guess which nation has the largest number of diplomats and the largest number of embassies in the world. It's China.
Johnny, do you want to say anything to add to any of that?
Well, only that, you know, the United Nations can only be successful when there is a degree of unity in the Security Council. And certainly at the moment, the levels of hostility within it mean that the permanent members can't agree on anything. So, I mean, I see a lot of blame being given to the Secretary General and others, and I've no view on how good or bad he is. All I can say is that anybody, however brilliant they were in the circumstances of today, would find it very, very difficult to make the UN effective.
And Michael, I mean, you know, the United Nations is a product of those who have created it. It is an outdated institution that was created at a time where there was a need, and it has not evolved to the level that it needs for today's complex world in which we're living in. And so I do think that is why you didn't see any of us really mention the United Nations, because I think there's a recognition that as an institution, it is not an effective institution. And I do not blame the Secretary General for the failures of the United Nations. I blame the fact that we need a different institution for our times, and the United Nations is not meeting those goals. Lastly, going back to what Johnny talked about a little bit about the question of Gaza and all of that, I could not agree more. Part of helping to solve the issue, whether it's in Gaza, which is really devastating, and everything else, goes back a little bit to what Lou talked about. The leaders that we put in place in many of these places are not serving the interest of their people. They haven't been doing it for a long time, and that is not going to change anytime soon. So our ability to really reconcile what is failed leadership that is there, that is not going to solve anything, to then think about what should be sort of the world, sort of the international community's responsibility toward these nations, I think is the larger question. Not simple at all, but it is a very important part of the equation. And then the other part of this is we cannot help but ask ourselves, who's funding this? Who is actually funding these wars?
Right. I'm going to ask another question now, which I'm going to ask each of you about this. This has been, as I said, a very sobering discussion. And I think that it's a discussion which should be seen wider than maybe we'll be able to show it. If you had people in your mind, one person even in your mind, that you think should see this debate, this discussion we've had this afternoon, wherever, who you think could help in one area or another, who would that be?
Tough question, Mike.
Yeah.
Well,
wants to start?
it's a very tough question, so I'll just dive in. I mean, I tell you who I'd like to watch it, and particularly the last bit and what Fanta said, what I've said on Gaza. I think Benjamin Netanyahu and his cabinet might want to watch it. Well, I'm sure they wouldn't want to watch it, and they wouldn't agree with it. But I think it is people have to understand that the myths that they create about what is necessary for their security quite often traps them in situations where they can't get out of, and I think some consideration of that is necessary to break the deadlock.
So the people that I would like to see are watching it are the newly selected head of Singapore, and whoever is going to be elected the head of Botswana in the election that's coming up soon. The two countries that I use in my teaching as examples for good governance in very different circumstances. And it's very important that they continue to be well-governed and the good governance continues. So I'd like to see the success stories be reinforced and know how important they are as models for all of us.
Okay.
I would like to see this being shown as a requirement for all students who are in IR at every institution around the world that teaches international relations, so that as we look at our future diplomats, our future policymakers and others, that they have an understanding of where success lies, but also what are the complexities of the situations we're dealing with. Because I do think our current generation and the future generation are going to inherit a lot of the mess that we have created. And so their ability to figure out how to problem solve that, I think, is going to be important. And part of that is education at the front end of that.
Anne?
I was going to say exactly the same, at least not
Right.
IR particularly, but I think students should see this, to see where we've got to and how impossible it's got, and how, as everybody said, the UN is now totally outdated and useless for the world we find ourselves in. And people have to learn a new sort of IR and think a new sort of IR, and not the stuff that they might have learned out of old textbooks.
Thanks for that. Sandy,
Mike,
could I ask you a question
may-
about how one of the big issues that was raised was the fact that the media, social media, but not the media, the official media, the BBC or whoever, ignore these matters as headline matters or any matters. I haven't seen the Sudan talked about on the BBC for years. How do people who are in the media start to influence the big companies to demonstrate that they ought to be putting on these things on the news?
You're
Or-
asking that question of me, Mike, is that right?
It's a question to you, because
Yes.
you've got this background in the media.
Yes, right. Well, I share your dismay and your perplexity over this. I think there is one basic issue that it continues to get worse and worse, which is that speed, getting something online as quickly as possible has taken over from careful research, from thoughtful dialogue, analysis, back and forth between people in a meaningful way, from the good old days. And of course, each of us in our own way has something to lament about how things have changed, but this is really a terrible problem. There are some beacons of good journalism that survive, and some of them are even doing well financially, but there are news deserts across the United States and the world where virtually nobody has access to a reliable daily source of information. Now, there are people fighting very hard to do something about this, creating nonprofit digital media. My own home state of Pennsylvania, there's a wonderful statewide digital daily newspaper that is bringing information to people that had gone away. But this is going to take some years to fix, and I don't know if it will ever be fixed. I mean, as long as there are hedge funds controlling media and then stripping them of their resources or throwing them away when they're no longer profitable, which is happening, I'm sure, not only in the United States, but around the world. Venture capital is taking over parts of the media, looking for profitable opportunities, and it's very, very difficult. In the developing world, it used to be that I spent some of my time, when I was still a sort of journalism educator of sorts, going to visit aspiring opposition newspapers, especially in African countries, but other places as well, newspapers, radio networks, drawing on my own background. And there was a real excitement about that. And as Fanta said, the young people, but the young people in the media have become cynical, just as the young people in politics and public affairs have become cynical. And it's very hard. The Nobel Prize Committee finds people to award, other journalism organizations find people to reward and to highlight and point out, but it's not the majority of people. So there's a values issue that is very much at stake and causes great worry for people who care about the future of information, of reliable information, because what everybody has said here today, nobody can truly make progress on her or his issues without information, without reliable information being available at very low cost in an equal and effectively distributed manner. And that's part of what we're missing.
Can I move it to Johnny, because Johnny's a member of a political party in the UK, which during the last election struggled to be seen on the television because it was always the two big parties. They did very well because they got 71, I think it was 71 MPs in the end. But I just wonder, Johnny, have we learned anything, or has your party learned anything for getting these kind of issues into the mainstream?
72 MPs, Michael. They're all
72,
hard
sorry.
earned, so I'm not going to lose out that one.
No. Layla won't forgive me for that, but carry on. Yeah.
No, I mean, I think the media team for my party understood something, which was they were going to get Frieser out of the debate unless they forced their way in. And they had a whole strategy to do that. They had a strategy of trying to engage through kind of fun antics, through stunts, but tied to a serious message, particularly around the health service and care. And a lot of it was derided, and I know because I know a lot of the people in that media team, how hard they found it, as donors were saying, "What are you doing? What is this?" But they did cut through. And they did the most important thing you do with a strategy, which is actually implement it and don't get pushed off it. And the result was going from 11 MPs to 72. So I take my hats off to them. Whether that is something that can be applied to the sort of world crisis we have, I don't know. But I do know the challenges that journalists find in getting stuff, on TV in a world of poly-crisis, because, I think we all slightly want to turn off and say, no, we can't deal with any more. But I think, as Fanta said at the beginning, a lot of this is selective, though. So I think we just have to keep, as policymakers, as influencers, to just keep banging the drum. I don't think there's anything else to do. And finding hooks. I mean, I've been doing a load of media today around malnutrition off the hook of this 40th anniversary of that broadcast. But we just all have to be creative and inventive, and that's all I can really contribute.
Thanks for that, Johnny. Fanta, do you want to have a final word?
Yeah, no, my final word is that as we think about the media, we also now know that most people are getting their news through social media and not our sort of traditional media outlets. So we have to keep in mind the modalities and the medium for how we look at that. One of the comments that was made, and it's by one of my colleagues, I think says it really beautifully too, which is that in order to have moral leadership, is it not important to think about the oath of do no harm, and that's an integral part of moral leadership? I could not agree more. In order for us to solve some of the critical issues that we've seen, and really just the horrific loss of life that we've seen around the world, and what that means for the people in those areas, for all of us, our ability to really think about, moral leadership in the way we've talked about. And this do no harm principle cannot be one that we need to stray away from. We need to double down on this. And we, the international community, needs to speak up, but not just speak up, we need to act. And we need to act with a greater sense of urgency. And our institutions that we've relied on, whether it's the United Nations and others, they mean well, but they're not going to be able to solve these issues. We're going to need different structures and different entities that will need to be constituted in order to address what are new and different challenges that we confront.
Thanks. Lou, can I give the last word to you? We're going to have to wind up then.
Sure. Well, I'll just repeat something I've said before. People need good examples. And I think my experience is people around the world want a world of social justice. And if they're bombarded with negativity, they won't know where to go. So we need to have examples of good leaders, examples of good institutions, examples of good outcomes to inspire people. And let's treasure them and communicate them to other people.
Thanks very much. Sandy, before I bring it all to a close, is there anything else you want to say?
Well, I just want to thank everybody who tuned in, and I think this is a very important discussion. I thank all of you for taking your time to talk about what is not in the news necessarily, and to have a sort of values-based discussion that I think is terribly important, and that is part of what Mike and I have been trying to do for now 4 years. This completes 4 years of monthly programs. We haven't missed one, Mike, and that's one of our own small contributions to try and do this. Our next one, by the way, will be on November 13th, just 8 days after the American presidential election. We'll be assembling some internationally competent experts to talk about the results of the US presidential election 8 days earlier and how the world's going to react to it. And so that's Wednesday, November 13th. Thanks to our institutions and all the support we get from them. John McCabe, my deputy here at Georgetown, takes a big part of the burden and handles it really quite competently. And we'll keep going onward, and we'll please, this program will be on YouTube and other websites, and we'll have thousands of people who see it eventually. And we can keep track of that to a certain extent. So there's some satisfaction in that. It's a great pleasure to work with you, Mike, and I turn things back to you now.
Thanks. To those thousands of people who watch it, perhaps they could pass it on and tell other people so that a lot of people watch it. I think it's been a really important debate. My thanks to Fanta, Anne Lonsdale, Lou Goodman, and Johnny Oates. Thank you all very much indeed. As you say, the next free speech project at the Crossroads with the Future of Humanities project will be on Wednesday, November the 13th, when we will be discussing the ramifications of the US election for America and the world. The next Cultural Encounters series will be next Monday on, which is the 28th of October, when a wonderful PhD student just about to get a Viva, I think, Jasmine Jones, from Oxford, will be discussing Beowulf, of all things. We go from now to way back. Could you note, and if to listen to Jasmine actually to give that poem or parts of the poem with in the original is just a joy. So please turn up for that. That's Monday the 28th of October. Jasmine Jones discussing Beowulf in the Cultural Encounters series. Note, if you're in the UK, that starts at 3 p.m. rather than the usual 4 p.m. because the UK has its clocks going back this weekend but the USA don't do it until the following weekend. We can't even agree on getting the clocks going back at the same time, but never mind. For today, my thanks to colleagues at Georgetown, President Jack DeGioia, who's still recovering and from a serious illness, and we wish him well. Tom Banchoff, the Vice President of Global Affairs. At Blackfriars to Dominic White, the new prior at Blackfriars, John O'Connor, the Regent, and Richard Finn, the Director of the Las Casas Institute. And at Campion Hall to Dr. Nick Austin, who's the Master of the Hall. Also, my thanks to John McCabe. My thanks also to Maggie, my wife, who helps with the administration of this series from the UK side. I'd like to thank all those who have asked questions, and I'd like to thank you for attending today and for your support of our various series. I'm Professor Mike Scott, Fellow and Senior Dean at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. You can follow me on Facebook as Michael Kerr Scott, or on LinkedIn as Professor Michael Scott. Until the next time, take care and goodbye. And again, my thanks to you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.